Apparently, two men approached the speaker's rostrum and discharged shots at him from apparently very close range.
As I turned around quickly, and the next thing I saw was Malcom falling back in a dead faint.
I heard shots, and I saw people crawling on the floor. And so I got down too. Then when I was looking out, and I saw someone look in amazement to the front, I knew they had shot my husband.
He sustained one shot in the lower right chin, and the other 6 hit him in the chest and body.
On February 21st, 1965 at 3:10 p.m., 3 gunmen opened fire inside Harlem's Audubon Ballroom. Within 15 seconds, Malcolm X, the man J. Edgar Hoover once called the most dangerous Negro in America, was dead. But to understand why Malcolm X was killed, you have to stop thinking in terms of bullets and betrayal and start thinking in terms of systems. This wasn't the story of a feud. It was the story of a man who threatened the economic, political, and psychological order of the United States. By 1965, Malcolm had evolved from a domestic dissident into a global force, one capable of uniting Black Americans, the African continent, and the Third World against Western hegemony. In the eyes of American intelligence, that made him a geopolitical risk, not just a social critique. When he died, the US was spending $22 billion annually on the Cold War and sending troops to Vietnam to protect democracy. But inside its borders, the government was spending millions surveilling its own citizens through COINTELPRO, a covert FBI program designed to neutralize influential Black leaders. Malcolm wasn't killed for what he believed in 1959. He was killed for what he was about to become in 1965. A bridge between oppressed people globally, an independent political voice, and perhaps the only Black leader America couldn't control. This is not just the story of Malcolm X's death. It's a story about how power reacts when truth becomes strategic, when charisma becomes contagious, and when one man starts to turn resistance into alignment. Before Malcolm X became a global voice, he was Malcolm Little, a product of America's racial contradictions. Born in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, he entered a world that had already decided his limits. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and outspoken supporter of Marcus Garvey's Pan-African movement. His mother, Louise, was educated and proud, but their defiance came at a price. Their house was burned by white supremacists when Malcolm was 4. 2 years later, his father was found dead, his body crushed under a streetcar. The police called it an accident. The family believed it was murder. After that, the system did what it always did. It broke families to maintain order. Social workers declared his mother mentally unfit, and Malcolm, at 13, was placed in foster care. By 17, he was a high school dropout, hustling in Boston and Harlem, shining shoes, running numbers, selling drugs, and burglarizing apartments. When he was arrested in 1946, America was still segregated, but its prisons were already an extension of its racial hierarchy. African Americans made up 10% of the population, but nearly 30% of federal inmates. Inside, Malcolm X discovered the 2 institutions that would define his transformation: the library and the Nation of Islam. He began reading obsessively: history, philosophy, linguistics. He copied the dictionary from A to Z to teach himself grammar and vocabulary. Months passed before I even allowed myself to go to sleep before 3 or 4 every morning, he later wrote. Every book I picked up opened up a new world. Through correspondence with his brother Reginald, Malcom was introduced to the Nation of Islam and its leader Elijah Muhammad. Their message was simple but revolutionary. Black people were not inferior. They had been deceived into believing they were. The nation rejected integration, calling instead for economic independence and moral discipline. For a man stripped of identity, that message was electric. When Malcom was paroled in 1952, he replaced Little, the name given by slaveholders, with X, symbolizing the unknown African name stolen by history. He entered the Nation of Islam not as a preacher, but as a strategist. Between 1952 and 1963, he built temples across America, growing the nation's membership from roughly 400 to over 40,000. He understood scale, how to turn anger into organization. He used radio, press, and debate to frame racism not as individual prejudice, but as a system that powered American capitalism. In one debate, he said, "You can't have a revolution without bloodshed, and you can't have capitalism without racism."
You haven't got a revolution that doesn't involve bloodshed.
That kind of precision frightened people. By 1961, Malcom was being monitored by the FBI under its counterintelligence program, which described him as a potential threat to the internal security of the United States. The Bureau planted informants in the Nation of Islam, intercepted his communications, and compiled over 1,000 pages of surveillance reports on him alone. But what made Malcom's rise different was that it wasn't just about race, it was about consciousness. He turned victimhood into agency. He taught Black Americans that the first revolution is mental, that liberation begins the moment you stop seeing yourself through someone else's eyes. This shift from dependence to dignity, from moral guilt to strategic awareness, was the foundation of his power. And once a man starts to awaken the minds of others, he becomes more than a preacher. He becomes a contagion. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X was no longer just a minister. He was a movement, articulate, fearless, and most dangerously, independent. And independence, as history always shows, is the one thing power can never forgive. By 1963, Malcolm X had become the public face of the Nation of Islam, its most disciplined soldier and its sharpest weapon. His speeches filled halls across America. His debates with journalists and civil rights leaders drew national attention. But as his influence grew, so did the tension between Malcolm the believer and Malcolm the thinker. Inside the Nation of Islam, loyalty was absolute. Elijah Muhammad was not just a leader, he was considered a divine messenger. The organization discouraged political involvement, voting, and collision with other civil rights groups, viewing them as tools of a corrupt system. But outside those walls, America was shifting fast. 1963 was a year of seismic energy. Martin Luther King led the March on Washington. The Civil Rights Act was being debated. Black Americans were being beaten in Birmingham and arrested in Albany. The nation's conscience was in revolt, and in this climate, Malcolm's message, by any means necessary, began to sound less like radicalism and more like realism. But power structures religious or political, are threatened most by those who evolve. Malcom was evolving. Two events triggered the rupture. First was Elijah Muhammad's personal scandal. In late 1963, Malcom learned that Muhammad had fathered several children with young secretaries in the organization, a direct violation of the strict moral code the nation preached. For Malcom, who had built his entire life on moral discipline, this was not just hypocrisy, it was betrayal. When he quietly questioned it, he was told to stay silent, that obedience was faith. But Malcom was never designed for silence. The second was the Kennedy assassination. After President John F. Kennedy's death, Elijah Muhammad ordered all members not to comment publicly. Malcom, defying that directive, told the press conference that it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. He meant that American violence abroad was now returning home. The backlash was immediate. Newspapers condemned him. Elijah Muhammad suspended him for 90 days, but in reality, the suspension was permanent. By early 1964, Malcolm X had left the Nation of Islam. He founded two new organizations, Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, modeled after the Organization of African Unity. The shift was profound. He was moving from theology to geopolitics. The FBI, sensing the transformation, intensified surveillance. COINTELPRO's files from that period showed increased wiretaps, infiltrations, and memos urging local police to disrupt his activities by any means necessary. He was now not just a dissident, but a data point in a national security file. His speeches began to blend religion, politics, and economics into a single framework. He started talking about colonialism, capitalism, and psychological warfare. You can't separate the American Negro from the global struggle for human rights, he said. The same interests that exploit you here are the ones exploiting people abroad. He no longer spoke of black separatism, but of black sovereignty, a distinction subtle yet revolutionary. He argued that African Americans should take their grievances to the United Nations, framing racism as a violation of international law. It was a brilliant reframing. Once you define racism as a human rights issue instead of a civil rights issue, it stops being an internal matter. It becomes a global embarrassment, and that is what made him dangerous. For the first time, an American activist was internationalizing the black struggle, aligning it with decolonization movements across Africa and Asia. In 1964, Malcolm visited Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia. Leaders like Nasser, Nkrumah, and Ben Bella welcomed him as an equal. He met African diplomats who promised to support his petition at the UN. It was no longer about America versus its citizens. It was about empire versus conscience. He returned from Mecca transformed, spiritually and strategically. He had witnessed Muslims of all races praying together, eating together, living as equals. I no longer subscribe to racism in any form, he said. I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. That was the new Malcolm. No longer nationalist, but humanist. No longer separatist, but globalist. But with that evolution came isolation. The Nation of Islam branded him a traitor. The FBI labeled him subversive. The State Department flagged his passport, and his Harlem home was firebombed just a week before his assassination. By then, Malcolm X had crossed an invisible line, the line that separates a critic from a catalyst. He was no longer fighting for power, he was threatening to redefine it. And in every age, history has shown, once a man stops being predictable, he becomes expendable. By early 1965, Malcolm X was living on borrowed time. He knew it. In his final interviews, he often spoke about death with unnerving calm.
No, I don't worry. I tell you, I'm a man who believed that I died 20 years ago, and I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear whatsoever of anybody or anything.
I live like a man who is already dead, he said. But beneath that composure was a man being hunted from outside and within. After his break with the Nation of Islam, the hostility escalated quickly. His phones were tapped, his mail intercepted. He was being followed constantly, sometimes by FBI agents, sometimes by nation members, sometimes by men whose allegiances were unclear even to him. The FBI's own records show that they had at least 8 undercover informants in his inner circle, including one who attended his final rally at the Audubon Ballroom. The Bureau had a file on him exceeding 4,000 pages, much of it dedicated to neutralization strategies. The word neutralize appears repeatedly, bureaucratic language for a moral crime. At the same time, within the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad's rhetoric had turned lethal. In one speech, he referred to Malcolm as worthy of death. Mosque members were told that he had betrayed the movement. His wife, Betty Shabazz, recalled receiving phone calls day and night. "We got a grenade for Malcolm. We're gonna get your husband." The threats were no longer abstract. They were operational. But the tragedy of Malcolm's death lies not only in who pulled the trigger, but in how the system prepared the ground. Let's examine the pattern. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI's COINTELPRO counterintelligence program targeted groups and leaders who were viewed as subversive, not because they were violent, but because they were influential. Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, Fred Hampton, all were tracked, infiltrated, or destabilized. The aim was to prevent the rise of what the FBI memo called a black messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Malcolm fit that profile perfectly. He was intelligent, disciplined, telegenic, and most dangerously independent of both white liberals and black institutions. So when the opportunity arose to let others do the dirty work, the system didn't need to pull the trigger. It just needed to stand aside. And that is exactly what happened. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem to address a crowd of about 400. His security team, usually tight and alert, had been oddly reduced that day. The police, who had normally stationed officers inside, were instructed to remain outside. Minutes before Malcolm began speaking, a disturbance broke out near the back, a staged diversion. As people turned, 3 men rushed the stage with pistols and a sawed-off shotgun. Within seconds, Malcolm was shot 21 times. What followed was chaos, but also a pattern of incompetence that bordered on design. The scene was never properly sealed. Key evidence disappeared. The autopsy report was incomplete, and while 3 men, all members of the Nation of Islam, were convicted, historians and journalists have since uncovered deep flaws in the investigation. In 2021, after a 2-year review by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, 2 of the 3 men convicted were exonerated: Muhammad A. Aziz and Khalil Islam, after nearly half a century of wrongful imprisonment. The investigation found that the FBI and NYPD had withheld exculpatory evidence that would have cleared them. Even the prosecutors admitted the government failed its duty. That leaves us with a haunting reality. The true conspiracy wasn't only in the bullets, but in the silence that followed. Malcolm X's death neutralized not just a man, but a movement that was about to evolve from anger into alignment. In the weeks before his death, he was building coalitions with African leaders, Caribbean socialists, and even young white activists. He was forming what could have become the first transnational anti-colonial network led from within the United States. That is the real reason he was dangerous. He was no longer just a black leader. He was becoming a global statesman. And history has a pattern. When vision expands beyond borders, bullets usually follow. Malcolm X died at 39. He never held public office. He never led an army. He never signed a law. Yet, 60 years later, his name still feels like a live wire, charged, uncontainable, impossible to sanitize. Why? Because Malcolm didn't just challenge racism, he challenged power itself. After his assassination, many tried to reduce him to an extremist, the angry counterpart to Martin Luther King Jr.'s dreamer. But that dichotomy was always a myth. In his final year, Malcolm and King's visions were converging. Both saw that the real issue wasn't segregation, it was structural inequality. Both understood that racism was an economic tool, a system that extracted labor, manufactured poverty, and maintained hierarchy. In 1965, when the average white family earned nearly twice as much as the average black family, Malcolm warned that equality without economic power was an illusion. Today, the median black household wealth in America is still less than 1/10 that of white households. The system changed its vocabulary, not its logic. Malcolm's genius was his ability to expose the architecture of control. He spoke of the media as the most powerful entity on earth because it controls the minds of the masses. He described the police not as protectors, but as the occupying army of poor neighborhoods. He reframed integration not as progress, but as dependence, asking, what are we integrating into? In a world now driven by algorithms, surveillance, and corporate propaganda, his critique feels eerily prophetic. The tools have changed, but the machinery of influence remains. He also forced the West to confront its hypocrisy. How could America champion freedom abroad while funding oppression at home? How could it condemn Soviet totalitarianism while denying citizens the right to vote in Selma? He saw that imperialism and racism were not separate diseases. They were symptoms of the same empire logic: divide, exploit, control. Today, Malcolm X's ideas live on, not in monuments or government holidays, but in movements. You can trace his influence in the Black Panther Party's community programs, in Pan-Africanism, in the rhetoric of Nelson Mandela and Kwame Nkrumah, in the self-determination ideals of modern grassroots activism. When people say, by any means necessary, they often think of militancy. But what Malcolm really meant was strategic dignity. The refusal to accept the terms of your own oppression. Even the US government eventually acknowledged the power of his transformation. In 1999, the FBI declassified thousands of pages on COINTELPRO. Buried within was a haunting insight. The Bureau feared not Malcom the militant, but Malcom the reformer. They wrote, should he abandon the Nation of Islam, he might unite the civil rights movement. And that was precisely what happened, and what sealed his fate. But here is the paradox. By killing Malcolm X, they created something far harder to silence. An idea immune to assassination. Every generation rediscovers him. Every protest borrows his clarity. Every truth teller stands on his shoulders, knowingly or not. Because Malcolm X's real legacy isn't in his death, it's in his diagnosis. He showed us that the struggle for justice isn't just about race, it's about power, information, and consciousness. And once people begin to see those connections clearly, control becomes impossible. That is why they killed Malcolm X, and that is why decades later, the system still fears what he taught. And liberation begins the moment you start thinking for yourself. When Malcolm X stood at a podium in 1964 and said, "The future belongs to those who prepare for it today," he wasn't speaking in metaphor, he was describing strategy, how the oppressed survive history's cycles. He understood something that many leaders still miss, that oppression doesn't vanish, it adapts. The plantation became the prison, the whip became policy, the overseer became the algorithm, and yet his solution was never despair, it was awareness. Malcolm believed that once people understood how systems work, they could no longer be manipulated by them. That is why he taught not just resistance, but literacy, political literacy, economic literacy, psychological literacy, because ignorance, he said, is the most effective weapon ever invented. Today, the weapons have evolved. We no longer face the FBI wiretap. We face the invisible algorithm. We are no longer told what to think. We are shown what to feel. And dissent no longer requires prison. It only needs distraction. But Malcolm X's words remain a blueprint for clarity. He taught that true freedom begins with naming the forces that shape you, whether it's a government, a market, or a screen. That power cannot be overthrown until it's understood, and that the first revolution is still the one inside the mind. When you strip away the myth, what remains is a man who mastered transformation. A thief became a thinker, a convict became a scholar, a nationalist became a humanist, and that metamorphosis, that courage to evolve in public, to outgrow even your own beliefs, is what power fears most. Malcolm once said, "If you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary." He lived by that. But perhaps his truer message is the one hidden behind it. That freedom isn't a destination, it's a discipline. And so, 60 years later, the question isn't who killed Malcolm X. The question is whether we still have the courage to think like him. Until next time, evolve.